Hi, I'm Rachel. Welcome back to Auxhart Gardening. Today is the first major seed starting day of the spring/summer season. So I'm going to show you my whole seed starting process, not just how I get the seeds in the dirt, but also how I decided when to do this and how many seeds to start, all of that. All right, so let's zoom in on my notebook here so I can show you my thought process. So I started out by making a simple list of all of the different varieties that I knew that I would need to start for the summer. And next to them, I put what the recommendation was for how soon to start them, how many days they need to germinate, and any special conditions. Like you'll see some of these need light to be able to germinate, and some of these, one of them at least says that I need to start it in a larger container because I'm planning to let it get a lot bigger before I transplant it out. And then the little peas off to the side are just to remind me that those are perennials. Then off to the right here, I used what I know about my last frost date and the plants and my environment to decide approximately when I think I want to put out each of these plants after they've been started. And then what I did was I counted back to the number of weeks that I have over on the left to choose a date that I would start the seeds. And this is a general date because you'll notice most of these are ranges of weeks that they need to be started ahead of time. And so this start date is just a general guideline for right about then is when I need to be starting stuff. So down here at the bottom, what I did is I looked at today, February 25th, and everything that it would make sense to start today. And then I'll do another batch in mid-March and another batch in mid-April. So if you just looked at that and you were like, oh wow, I don't even know where to start figuring out what you just said, I do have a video for you. You can go ahead and click it up here. I talk all about the sorts of factors you need to consider when you're deciding when to start your seeds. And that will help you out a lot figuring out how all the different things you need to consider in terms of the size you want your plants to be before you plant them out, and the sort of environment that you want to be planting them out into, and so on and so forth. So that's not going to be covered here, but that will be covered up in that video. All right, so I'm just going to flip over to the next page where I calculated how many plants I want and then tried to figure out how many seeds I should be starting. So if you remember, I did a few weeks ago a full garden plan for the spring and the summer. And so I went back to that plan and tried to kind of guesstimate about how many plants would fit in each of the areas that I designated for those plants. So you'll see here each category of plant has a number next to it, and then that's separated out into variety so that I can kind of figure out how many of each variety of thing I need. You'll notice that eggplant has an arrow that says cups, so I'm starting eggplants in cups instead of these little pots because I already know that I'm starting them way ahead of when I'm going to plant them out with the intention of letting them get bigger before I actually put them in the ground. So I'm just going to skip the potting up step with those and go ahead and start them in cups. Since I'm only planting 6 eggplant plants this year, that is space efficient for me to do. If I was planting out like 40 eggplants, I might consider potting up if I know that I'm going to be kind of limited on space. You'll also notice that the tomatoes have big box start written next to them. That is this. These are just the 4x4 version of these. 4 of these will fit in there. And tomatoes, you can start a whole bunch of them in a single container like this because they do kind of separate out and transplant well. And so this will help condense the amount of space that I need to be heated while things are germinating. And then I can take that and pot them up into either individual little pots or maybe something a little larger if I need to at a later time, because it is important to kind of consolidate everything small if you are in a position where you need to use a heat mat to germinate your seeds. A couple of years ago, when I had a very, very small space to start my seeds, I actually started seeds in little like plastic condiment containers Some of you may recognize them as little containers you buy for Jello shots at a party, but they're just little plastic containers with a lid, and you put a little damp paper towel in there and put your seed on top and cover it, and then you can like stack a bunch of those onto a little heat mat, and once they germinate, you can take them out and put them into little cups like this, and they no longer need that heat because they've already germinated. They still need to be warm, but they don't need that like 80-degree germination temperature. So if you're working with a much smaller space, that is always an option. And I can go ahead and link the video where I describe that more in depth for you there. So that's eggplants and tomatoes covered. Everything else is getting started in these little pots. These are about 2 by 2 inches by I think 4 inches tall. And these just stack really nicely in all the trays. And I went through the math to figure out how many trays worth of these I would need to start all of the peppers and the milkweed and the bee balm, which are the only 2 non-pepper things that I'm starting in these little cups. So you'll see in my math here in the middle, I calculated how many plants I actually wanted, which is 76. And then I'm gonna add 22 to that because that's 1 extra for each. So in case something happens to one of my starts once it's bigger, I will have an extra for that. That does not count the extra seeds that I'm planting in order to make sure that I get the right number of plants. So there will be more seeds than this planted. This is the number of containers that will have a single, hopefully healthy plant in them. And then any that are extra that don't actually fit in the garden, I can just give away to people. But I would like to have that extra there just in case, especially since if you look back at the page, some of these plants I'm only planning on having 1 of in the garden. And y'all know from what I've said before, having just 1 of a certain variety in the garden, it's a little risky. So I'm gonna minimize that risk at the front end by having 2 plants to choose from so that I can choose the healthier one. And then the rest of these extras, you know, if I'm gonna have 8 of a plant in the garden, this 1 extra, it probably won't be needed, but it's still nice to be able to choose the healthiest ones and discard one that is not looking as great. And if they're all looking great, then like I said, I can just give them out to my friends. So if we go back to this math, if I have 76 plants I want plus 22 extras, that is 98 containers, and I can do 40 of those per tray, so I need 2.5 trays of these little cups. And I know from experience that 1 bag in my seed starter mix can fill out basically 1 tray. So that also helps me to decide how much seed starter mix to go buy. So it actually works out really well that I'm doing some of these tomatoes in these big boxes because this is exactly half a tray. So I've got my 2 other trays ready, and then this half tray, it just worked out that way. It's very convenient. All right, so now that we've got the math out of the way, let's talk about how we're putting seeds in dirt. Okay, so when you are putting seeds in your trays, there are 2 things that are really important to get right. The first one is the depth of the seed, and that is generally pretty easy to calculate. You just want to take a look at the size of your seed and plant it about twice as deep as it is big, and that's that. If it's really, really tiny, you're just going to kind of gently press it into the soil or maybe dust a little bit of dry soil on top of it. Pat it down real good so that it gets contact with the soil and can get moisture. And if it's bigger, you might want to for example, when I'm planting beans out in the garden, I will shove like all the way up to my knuckle in the soil to push a bean seed down because those are so big. So that's the first thing. The second thing is labeling. I think it's incredibly important to properly label your starts, especially if you're new, because you might not know what those seedlings look like. So you might not know, which one of these are the tomatoes, which one of these are the peppers. And even if you're experienced, like me, I can tell a tomato start from a pepper start, even from the first leaves. However, I cannot tell if something is going to be an Amish paste tomato or San Marzano tomato until they're literally making tomatoes. So it's really important to make sure that you've got your labels on your plants and you carry those over all the way into the garden. And just as an aside on labeling, I've tried a few different ways of labeling my plants, and I've kind of come to the conclusion that I'm gonna like split my methods. So in seed starting trays, everybody's gonna get a cute little tag, and then these tags are gonna get saved and reused next year, and they are not gonna get put out in the garden because even though I have invested in a theoretically UV resistant Sharpie, I have not found that to be true of this Sharpie. So every label that I put out in the garden last year bleached, and I still didn't know what everything was. So my plan to combat that is to make a little drawing of my garden and label stuff on paper in my notebook once it's out in the garden. And that way I can just flip to that and see, okay, this is the row of San Marzano tomatoes. And once I've looked at it a few times, I kind of get it memorized, but that is currently how I'm trying to handle labeling. All right, so now that I've got some seeds planted, I'm going to show you where I'm setting them up and what conditions I'm giving them. Please excuse the mess, but this is currently what I'm working with. I will need to clear off these shelves for my other trays, but this one that we just planted, it's got heat mat under it, and it is right here under these lights. These are not necessarily marketed as grow lights, but they do meet all of the conditions of a grow light. And MI Gardener has a really good video where he explains all of that. So instead of repeating all of his good information, I'll just link his video in the description. You'll notice I also have a cute little fan here, and that is for after the seedlings sprout to kind of keep the air moving, since this is a closed room, so that they can kind of wiggle around a little bit and get strong stems and be ready to go outside. All right guys, I'm going to go ahead and plant out the rest of my trays. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I read them all and try to help everybody that I can. If this is your very first year starting seeds, I've got a video about seed starting mistakes you should avoid, so you might want to check that out. Thanks for watching. Happy gardening.